Thank you, Professor Pappé. I think it's time we start this wonderful lecture, which we've all been looking forward to for a long time. And so welcome all of you to the first citizen lecture, Gaza Bleeds, the historical, moral, and strategic context of the war on the Palestinians. The lecture is by the Israeli historian and political scientist, Professor Ilan Pappé. We're also happy that all of you took time out to join us from across the globe to attend this lecture. The Citizen, as we know, is an independent online news daily. And we believe that an independent media can thrive if it is citizen-led and funded. So the citizen is you, global citizens who care about values, truth, and transparency. Seema's already read out the house rules, as it were, and we encourage you to ask questions while the professor is speaking in the chat box, and we will put the questions to him when he concludes the lecture. During the webinar, the attendees' mics will be on mute so that we can hear the professor well, and the videos for the attendees will also be switched off. However, we once again encourage you to please ask questions in the chat box. And now I hand over the mic to Seema Mustafa, the founding editor of The Citizen, a war correspondent and a geopolitical expert. Seema, over to you. The virtual mic is now yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Karuna, and thank you for laying it all down. Most welcome, Professor Ilan Pappé, and we can't thank you really enough for agreeing to give this lecture at our invitation. Invitation by The Citizen and our entire team of reporters and writers, a digital newspaper that really exists to keep issues and ethics alive. So in short, to keep independent journalism from fading out of an increasingly hostile environment all over the world. Professor Pappé, as most of you would know, is an Israeli historian. He was born in Haifa, Israel. He's an independent soul who never hesitated to speak his mind and to write the history he knew to be factually correct and honest. And needless to say, he ran foul of the Israeli establishment and left as far back as 2007, 2008 to join the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom as a professor of history. He is also the director of the university's European Center for Palestine Studies. And perhaps what you said, Professor Pappé, in 2004 is becoming crystal clear now, that the aim has always been, and it still remains, to have as much of Palestine as possible, with as few Palestinians in it as possible. Professor Pappé has been one of the most important voices on the Palestinian issue in recent years, but especially so in the past 4 months since October 7th, as the world watches a genocide unfold in front of it on camera. Despite the people's pressure from all corners of the world, Israel has refused to budge, and its mentor and creator and nurturer, the United States, has vetoed every resolution calling for a ceasefire and continues to supply weapons for the violence to continue. Human bestiality is on vivid display, and even as we speak, Palestinians are being killed by the hour, now crowded together in Rafah, where just 2 days ago, the Israelis allowed a few humanitarian trucks in and then fired upon and killed the Palestinians, the starving Palestinians who were trying to get the food. So we wait, even as we wait to hear Professor Pappé, which will be in a second from now, memories of the proud Palestinians fighting for their homeland flash by from the 1982 Beirut War, which I had covered, and then again in 2006 later, where they were not directly involved, but responsible and part of that war of the Hezbollah and Israel. As far back as 1982, we could see the manipulation of the news by the big media at the time. And there was big media, even if television of the way we see it today hadn't caught on. It was the global news agencies, AFP from France, AP from the USA, Reuters from the UK. And we found in Beirut, and at least I found in Beirut when I went, that every perception, every stereotype that they had created of the Palestinians and news about the war itself was busted by the actual situation on the ground. I'm not going to go into details, but we wrote that at the time. The lies have just got bigger, the prejudice much worse, the exploitation of news total. We also found the Arab countries hypocritical, as the actions for the Palestinians did not match the rhetoric, as we can see even today, perhaps in a far more stark and much darker way. So we wait now to hear from you, Professor Pappé, about the past, the present, and the future, where perhaps you will bring some hope into this tunnel, which seems dark and endless. I pass the mic on to you, sir.
Thank you, Sima. Thank you to the staff and people in the Citizen. Particular thanks to my friend Ranjan for mediating between us and making this possible. I do apologize about my voice. It's a bit cracked, but I hope I will be you could understand what I'm saying. As you probably know, there is a kind of a battle of narratives about what goes on in Gaza, and this is between probably Israel and its allies and the rest of the world. The Israeli insistence or demand from anyone who is watching the events in Gaza is to look at them as if they have no historical context. They have no context at all. This is just a vile act. The only reason for it is either deep anti-Semitism, namely hatred of Jews, or not or, combined with an attempt by the regional power of Iran to wipe out Israel. The rest of the world and most of the reasonable people, which included at the time also the General Secretary of the United Nations, understood that what happened on the 7th of October in the south of Israel on the border with Gaza can only be properly understood if one knows the historical and moral context for the actions of the Hamas on that day. And you need that kind of historical and moral context also to understand the Israeli reaction that very quickly turned into a genocide of the people of Gaza. The most important probably historical context is the one that goes quite deep into history, and that begins with the very nature of the Zionist movement that arrived in Palestine in the late 19th century, a movement of settler colonialism, as we call it among scholars, to differentiate it between classical colonialism and the kind of colonialism that ended up in genociding indigenous people in places such as North America and Australia. Zionism was such a movement, and typically to a settler colonial movement, it was made of refugees themselves, people who were self-victims of persecution in Europe, who were looking for a safe place, or if you want, another Europe. And as typical to other settler colonial movements, chose a place where already someone else lived, an indigenous population. And as the late great scholar of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolfe, said, in the encounter between settler colonial movements, namely these European refugees or people who found that Europe doesn't want them, and the indigenous people, the logic of the elimination of the native was activated, because the main obstacle for creating a new Europe instead of the Europe that didn't want them was the presence of other people in the places they coveted. And the same happened with the Zionists. They came to a place already inhabited, where there was a thriving Palestinian society, undergoing modernization, undergoing national cohesion processes, and they were the main obstacle for creating an exclusive Jewish state instead of their homeland. In the case of Palestine, of course, at the begin with, we're not talking about genocide as happened in North America, but the aims of the Zionist leaders and settlers was very clear from the very beginning that they want to create an exclusive Jewish space. And until the end of the 20th century, even at the beginning of this century, despite all their efforts, there's still only half of the population in the land that they desired. And when they started their ethnic cleansing operations in the 1920s, there were only 15% of the population. Like all settler colonial movement, these two dimensions are very important: space and population, demography and geography, if you want. And in 1948, there was an historical opportunity that I don't have time to go to all the necessary evidence about it. But there was an opportunity in 1948 because the British rule of Palestine came to an end to try and change dramatically both the demography and the geography of Palestine. Under the circumstances of 48, the Zionist movement was much stronger than the Palestinians and was able to expel half of the Palestinians during the year that the Palestinian calls the Nakba, destroy half of the Palestinian villages and towns, and most of the towns, actually more than half of the towns, and take over 80%, almost 80% of Palestine. And no wonder the Palestinians see until recently, 1948 is the worst year in their history. And the Israelis see 1948 as a miraculous year, the best year in the history of the Jewish people and in the modern history of Israel. What happened in 48 is very relevant to what goes on in Gaza because most of the people in Gaza are refugees from that ethnic cleansing. The Gaza Strip itself did not exist before 1948. Gaza was a small town on the Via Maris between Egypt and Turkey, a very cosmopolitical place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims coexisted. And in 1 year, because of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians during 1948, it became the biggest refugee camp in the world. The reason Israel created the Strip, as I said, which was never there before 1948, Israel created the Strip because its plan to remove Palestinians by force in 1948 was to move them to the north, to Lebanon and Syria, to the east, to Jordan, and to the south, to Egypt. But Egypt refused to receive the Palestinian refugees. So Israel decided to give up a small part of Palestine called the Gaza Strip. It's 2% of Palestine. Created this rectangle that you can see on the map and pushed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from central and south Palestine into the Gaza Strip. So the older generation of people in Gaza are people who were pushed by force into a strip that became the biggest refugee camp in the world. There's one particular interesting group in Gaza to which the leader of the Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, belongs. And these are the people who lived on 11 Palestinian villages very close to what became the Gaza Strip. These particular villages were expelled by the end of 1948 as the last phase of the ethnic cleansing. Their villages were burned and the people were forced by shooting to cross over to Gaza. So there is a particular link between the people of Gaza and people like Yahya Sinwar and the particular kibbutzim and Jewish settlements that were attacked on the 7th of October. These particular places which the Hamas attacked on the 7th of October are built on the ruins of the Palestinian villages from which the people were expelled into Gaza. So that's one historical context, the 48 context. There is a more recent context, 56, 57 years of occupation since 67. And it doesn't matter whether you live in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. whatever happens in the West Bank happens to you in Gaza as well. 56 years of ruthless, cruel military oppression that left people wounded, arrested without trial, killed, houses demolished, fields burned, and people expelled. And Gaza was under such occupation until 2007. And people also feel that burden as well as part of the awful things that happened to them in 1948. But the most important context is the most recent one. And this is 17 years, not 17 years, I'm sorry. I would say, well, really 17 years by now. Yeah, almost 17 years of siege that was imposed by Israel on Gaza in 2007. A siege that Israel imposed on Gaza because the people of Gaza democratically elected a government Israel didn't like, the Hamas government. And the siege was closed Gaza as not just as the biggest refugee camp in the world, now it became the biggest prison in the world. People could not get in, cannot get out without Israeli permission. Israel decided how much food goes in, how much medicine goes in, and so on. And whenever the resistance reacted to this inhuman siege, Israel attacked the people of Gaza from the air, the land, the sea, 4 times. The attacks from the air are particularly devastating because these are huge bombs which are dropped on cities and villages. And even if you're not killed or wounded by such a bombing, you are scarred for life, traumatized by a 1-ton bomb that falls on your head. So anyone who is below 23, 24 in Gaza knows only the reality of siege and the reality of the 4 bombings. And 60% of the population in Gaza are below 23. 100% of the people who did the attack on the 7th of October, 100% are people who were born into the reality of the siege and the bombing. They knew no other reality. These are important historical and moral contexts. The moral context is also important. I mean, beyond, I think there is already a morality in what I was talking about. The moral context is that unless you understand that the Palestinian struggle is an anti-colonialist struggle, you will not understand that, yes, there are moments when the anti-colonial struggle crosses international law, violates international law, commits actions that should not be committed, no doubt. But there is not one anti-colonialist struggle that didn't have its moments of frustration, of violence, of just an outburst of people who were dehumanized, treated as animals for 17 years. And no wonder that at the moment of relative victory for a very short while, there are things that are being done which should not be done. But this does not invalidate in any way the justified liberation struggle of the Palestinians, the justified demand for the end of the siege, the end of the occupation, the release of the political prisoners, all these things which the Hamas demanded for many years and other Palestinian factions in the liberation movement were asking for. We all remember instances in history such as the rebellion of slaves in America that murdered their slave owners' families, the rebellion of the FLN in Algeria that targeted sometimes families of French settlers. These things happen, but they in no way do they invalidate the justification for the struggle for decolonization, liberation, and freedom. So we should not lose our moral compass, as Israel wants us to do. And we don't know exactly still what happened, one should say. I mean, I think we should still wait. I don't believe the Israelis. It is very difficult to have an independent inquiry exactly what happened. So this also should be said. But even if half of what we know is true, this is a point to be made. What is very clear, and for this we don't need an international investigation, is what Israel did after the 7th of October. A genocidal operation that at first was presented as a reaction to what the Hamas did, but very soon, as always happens in Israeli actions against the Palestinian, the pretext that they are using is not important. What is important was what is the real aim behind it. Israel never knew what to do with the Gaza Strip. It has a very clear strategy for the rest of Palestine. Inside Israel, Israel operates a system which is democratic for the Jews, but not democratic for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And in the West Bank, Israel has a clear strategy of incrementally Judaizing the West Bank, getting more and more Jews into the West Bank, hoping that this will force more and more Palestinians to leave the West Bank. So the Israeli endgame in the West Bank is eventually to have only a small Palestinian presence there, and the rest should be annexed to Israel. And for some reason, the Israelis think that this could hold water. But with Gaza, it wasn't very clear how to do this. Again, because while you can push Palestinians from the West Bank to Jordan, it seems you cannot push Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Egypt. And the Palestinians are steadfast in Gaza. They would also not leave, even if you try to force them. So this opportunity came after the 7th of October to try something else. If you cannot ethnically cleanse people, you can try and genocide them. Now, it's not easy to genocide people in the 21st century with the watchful eyes of the world. So you make sure it doesn't seem like a genocide. You talk about collateral damage to civilian citizens because of the nature of the resistance and the nature of the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. Israel proudly says, through lawyers such as Alan Dershowitz, who represents it in the world, very proudly say, we have a ratio of 2 to 1. On every Hamas person we kill, we only kill 2 citizens. Even if this is true, which is not true, by the way, but even if that is true, it means that they killed 20,000 citizens, all of them almost children and women. Why do the Israelis think that this will sound reasonable, legitimate, is beyond our comprehension unless we understand the exceptional immunity that Israel enjoys in international judicial systems and in the global north. But I think that the ratio is far worse, actually. I think Israel killed about, as the American Secretary of State for Defense said yesterday, he said, and I think this is the right figure, he said 5,000 Hamas fighters were killed. 25,000 women and children were slaughtered by Israel in the last 4 months. The amount of TNT dropped on Gaza is thrice more, 3 times more, the amount of the bomb that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in the Second World War. It's just unbelievable the kind of inferno that Israel created in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli Jewish society is totally behind this genocide. Very few voices against it. We should say it's important. More than 90% of the Israeli Jews support the genocide of Gaza. You have no hope for change within Israel if you want to stop the genocide or if you want to stop future genocides. However, I think that this is also part of a wider picture we should have to take into account. which is the kind of the light in the end of the tunnel. The way Israel is now built mentally, culturally, and politically is a society that does not evolve, would not evolve in any different way in the near future. Namely, it would support the use of power in order to deal with this issue that faced Zionism from the very beginning, that in Palestine lives a Palestinian people. They have no new ideas what to do with this. And what happens throughout the years, they use more and more force to solve the problem. And the Palestinians use more and more resistance to stop their extinction. So why there is a light in the end of the tunnel? Because this particular process shows the weakness of the Israeli society. You cannot really create a state that is just based on constant policing, oppressing, and fighting another people, especially people who live with you. If this is the only vision for the future for Israel, not a lot of Israelis will remain in Israel. You cannot see your children and grandchildren involved all the time in wars, bloodshed, and violence, even if you have the upper hand. And the 7th of October raised the big question whether Israel would always have the upper hand. If a small army of guerrillas nearly defeated the Israeli army, imagine what would happen if two armies of guerrillas would attack Israel at the same time, or if regional armies would attack Israel. I mean, this Israeli hope that they will always be invincible is not a vision for a future state that wants to be democratic, liberal, pluralist, part of the global north, regardless of whether they are successful in it or not. But this is not the only process that shows us that Israel is going through a process that would eventually lead to its disintegration, or if you want, to the end of the Zionist project. The second problem that Israel has is that the lack of any social cohesion. The idea that Judaism is religion is not working. I think also in India, one day, some people would realize it. You cannot make a state out of a religion. You cannot make nationalism out of religion. If you want a proper nationalism, it has to be without a religious identity. But we'll put that aside. In Israel, for the first time, Israelis understanding, and this has nothing to do with the Palestinians. Secular Jews and religious Jews have nothing in common. The only thing they have in common is the hatred of the Palestinians. And they need to survive in an alien region. But they are alienated region, of course. But without any connection, it's not working. There are two different people who have nothing in common. And they were already on the verge of a civil war before the 7th of October. In many ways, the 7th of October saved Israel from a civil war, but only temporarily. This will come back. It's already coming back, by the way. It's already coming back. Another process that leads to the end of Zionism, in my mind, is the international community. There is a huge support for the Palestinians. There's a huge pressure on governments to define Israel as a pariah state. It hasn't happened yet in a governmental level, but there are indications that this could happen very soon. Because the way Israel behaves and going to behave would make it very difficult for its friends in the governments and the international community to continue to support it. Even the cynical friends of Israel, such as India and the United States, who want Israel as a military partner, are finding actually that the Israeli military industry is not the only one that exists. And there are cheaper and better partners, even for that market. So the Israeli security and military industry that holds the Israeli economy together is weakening. And altogether, the Israeli economy goes under a huge crisis that was only accentuated by the war. There's a change in the Jewish communities in the world attitude towards Israel. The young generation of Jews does not see themselves as Zionists. And without the Jewish community's support, it would be very difficult to sustain Israel. they will always have the support of the Christian Zionists, fundamentalist, evangelical Christians, because they see it as a religious imperative. But this is not enough to sustain Israel. And the Palestinian resistance will continue. And there might be change in the Arab world that will make the region even more hostile to Israel. So all in all, I can see processes that show the beginning of the end of the Zionist project. It's a very dangerous period because I'm talking about 20, 25 years or 20 years. And it is a period when, like in South Africa, the regime is fighting for its life and has no inhibitions. So it's a very dangerous moment, very dangerous for the Palestinians, the next 10, 15 years. I really dread to think what's going to happen. There's also a question who will fill the void after the disintegration. The Palestinian national movement is not ready yet to make such a move. It's disunited, fragmented, doesn't have a proper leadership, doesn't have a proper representative organization. They have to really prepare themselves because a void is always filled. And a void that isn't filled becomes chaotic and dangerous. But I think all in all, in the long run, there is a dawn after this dark night of ours. And it is a dark night. It's a very dark night we're living here in Palestine. But I think there is a dawn that would lead to a different kind of political structure, not only in Palestine, in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. I think people there understand that the nation state, the European nation state that was imposed on them at the end of the First World War is not fitting the realities where they live. I think that they will invent a new political system that will reflect better the communal identities, the needs of the people. And Palestine could be a leading beacon in this effort. So I'll stop here, and I'm gladly looking forward to hear your comments and questions.
I'll ask the questions as they have appeared on the chat. One is, of course, a comment for you, Professor, from Anuita, which she says, what an honor to listen to you, Professor Pappé. Hope you get energy from all of us here. And that is also because we had said you were not well, and and I'm glad your voice has held out for this very, very important lecture. The first question is from Mahalingam M. I'll introduce a couple of people who I do recognize, which is him. He's a scholar. And he wants to know what is the relevance of the United Nations given its silent spectator position in the context of the Gaza genocide.
A very good question. I think the main test is now not so much the United Nations, but the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which is part of the United Nations. People forget it's part of the United Nations. Because the eyes of the world are now directed to the ICJ. If the ICJ is going to act decisively on the genocide, as it has been asked to by South Africa, then it may salvage its image, especially in the global South and among people who already lost faith in what the United Nations represents anymore, and its institutions such as the ICJ represent. I think that if the ICJ would fail to take real action, and if the United Nations would still be ruled through the Security Council as an American puppet, the faith of people in the universality of the United Nations would decrease significantly, and we will have to think of a different kind of universal bodies. I know there's already talk in the global South of preparing a parallel institution because the sense is that the United Nations is unable to represent the interests of the nations of the world as its charter demands. So I think the United Nations is not able to save Gaza, is not able to stop the genocide so far, And if this would be the judgment of all of us, that the United Nations was helpless in stopping that genocide, people would say, what is the need for such an organization altogether if it doesn't save people from such a crime against humanity? And probably either it would have to change dramatically from within, or we will have to create a different organization.
Right. There is Ambassador K.B. Fabian, who's former diplomat. He wants to know whether President Biden is serious and sincere when he says that the US wants a Palestine state.
I think it depends, Ambassador, how you define the Palestinian state. If you're thinking about a small Bantustan with hardly any sovereignty, totally under the mercy of Israel, stretching over a small part of the West Bank, which means even a smaller part of historical Palestine, maybe with a small enclave in Gaza, which is not really a state. It's just a small enclave ruled by Israel from the outside, then yes, that's what Biden wants. But I think that if you're thinking genuinely of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, I think the United States long time ago gave up on this idea. It does not dare to confront Israel that has 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, and tries to impose on the Palestinian the Israeli version of a two-state solution. The problem for Biden now is that even the old Israeli version of two-state solution is not something that Israel is willing to give now as well. So Biden can talk about a Palestinian state, but the issue is, for America is not the Palestinian state. The issue for America is, are they willing to face Israel in stopping the genocide in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, the continued colonization of the West Bank, the apartheid system inside Israel. And so far, Biden has proven to be more Zionist than the Zionists when it comes to such issues. Sometimes he talks the right talk, but as the American says, he never walked the walk.
Sure. The next question, I think I've answered a bit of it, but I'll ask it anyway. It's from a filmmaker, Agnes Singh. This is in the light of recent events, is a one-state solution still viable? If not, what are the alternatives?
Probably the question was, is it one state or the two-state solution viable? But never mind, yes. I think, first of all, the two-state solution, to my mind, is not viable anymore. I think it has been dead for many years. And if you want, its corpse is lying in the morgue, but nobody dared to have a funeral for it. Realistically, on the ground, there is no space for a Palestinian state unless you're willing to evict 700,000 Israeli settlers and demolish their settlements. And some of these settlements are proper cities. There's no government in the world in Israel who would ever do this. So without that, there's no point in talking about two-state solution when there's no space for two-state solution. But even more than that, morally speaking, the two-state solution does not answer most of the outstanding problems that are at the heart of the Palestine question. It does not offer a solution to the Palestinian refugees. It offers a solution only for 20% of Palestine and only to half of the Palestinian people. And this will never work. So both morally and practically, I think two-state solution is invalid. The only solution is one democratic state for all, from the river to the sea, which is something the Palestinians, I think, eventually would ask for. They already ask it in the future, but they would try to compromise with Israel and America, and were willing to go for the two-state solution, only to find out that there's no one there to talk to on the Israeli side. So I think they will go back to the democratic solution, one person, one vote, and this with the return of the Palestinian refugees. This is the only way that you can assure justice in Palestine. And this is through respecting the principle of equality. Every solution America and Israel offered were based on inequalities, social, economic, national, and cultural. We need a solution that promises equality, because this is the main thing that was denied to the Palestinians. Equality in normal life. The only way to do it is in one state where everybody would be equal, regardless of their religion, gender, nationality, ethnicity. And if we won't have this solution, we will have a continued bloodshed and a conflict.
Right. So there's Karuna John, who's the copy editor with the Citizens, and she wants to know how you read the potential impact of George Galloway's electoral victory, given the fact that he's fought it on Gaza.
I think it might be, it's difficult to say, but he's only one person in a parliament of hundreds of MPs. But I think that if he will succeed as he wants, to take his Democratic Party from Rochdale and have 50, as he wants, 50 members of parliament running on the same ticket, especially where there are strong Muslim communities in Britain, given the British political system of constituencies. I think this could really be important, because a lot of people in the left of the Labour Party are looking for a new party. And that new party would put Gaza and Palestine as one of its major demands. And this could be the start of a fundamental change in the politics of the left in Britain that has been unashamedly pro-Israeli since the establishment of the State of Israel. And it might signal a new period. Although he himself can do a lot, he won't be able to do it by himself. So he needs, like all of us, if we want to make an impact, we need to be part of an institution and movement. You cannot do things individually.
Kamil wants to know what you think should be the role of the media in conflicts such as Israel and Palestine, and what is the media trying to accomplish by manipulating the news? Is it to control the dissent, or is it something else? Perhaps I can add more sinister.
Yeah. Well, I think we're talking here about mainstream media, of course, and not alternative media.
Yes.
Mainstream media could have done a lot by changing the language in which he talks, just by changing the words, by using words like genocide, by using words like anti-colonialism, apartheid, in the case of Israel and Palestine. It would have changed public opinion, there's no doubt about it. But it uses the dictionary that Israel wants it to use and doesn't dare to use alternative dictionary. Are they doing it because they want to manipulate opinion? I don't know. From my perspective, I think that in most cases, and I looked at it in a new book of mine that will come out very soon, the Western media is under a strong influence of the Israeli lobby. And this means that part of what they're doing is out of timidity. Part of what they're doing is out of being bribed. And part of the most important human feature of behavior is that you don't want to get into trouble with a strong lobby. So it doesn't matter what you think. You don't want to be condemned as an anti-Semite. So you're very careful. You're self-censoring yourself. So I'm not sure about manipulating so much public opinion as much as being obedient to a narrative that if you're not obedient to, you might find yourself being accused of being an anti-Semite. And people don't want to be in that position unless they're very brave, like the late John Pilger.
Yes.
But we don't have many courageous journalists in the mainstream media in the West, in the North, in the global North, unfortunately.
Right. Nikita Jain, who's a very senior correspondent with The Citizen and very, very passionate about the Palestinian cause, is asking, what is the role of international laws? Will Israel and its allies like the US and UK be held responsible for what they are doing to the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, as it has been established that they are conducting a genocide?
Yes, the international law, very much like the United Nations, is something we should talk about, because it's very interesting that when the international law kind of was institutionalized after the Second World War, under the impact of the Holocaust particularly, but not only, it took it sometimes to try and adapt and be in international law for all. So in 1960, for the first time, international law tribunals and institutions were willing to define colonialism as a violation of international law, only in 1960. But when in 1960, some people ask, what about settler colonialism? Namely, what about the violation of the rights of indigenous people in North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and Palestine? The international legal institution refused to include settler colonialism as a violation of international law. And that's why the international law in Palestine, its impact on Palestine is so weak. Because it can help there's a section in international law called international human rights law. International human rights law at least can point to the violations of what Israel does to Palestinians individually in the West Bank. But it doesn't have any way of really tackling the main issue, because it's not allowed, for example, to define the ideology of Zionism as racism, as was demanded by the members of the United Nations who voted in 1975, equating Zionism with racism. If you don't tackle the ideology as the main violation of human rights, you have to, according to international law, to ask yourself, is the judicial system of the country that you are criticizing capable of dealing with most of these violations itself? And as you know, Israel has this image of a very solid and very respected judicial system. And therefore, international law, there's a limit to what it can do. If it would have understood that the judicial system in Israel is totally loyal to the Zionist ideology, that would have been a different game. But they won't do it until, I think, the political systems would begin to question the validity of Zionism as an ideology of a state. And therefore, I don't expect international law to help the Palestinians to liberate themselves. It doesn't mean we should not continue to ask our friends in international law to, voice their criticism on any violation of human rights. But I wouldn't put my trust as a Palestinian that international law would help me to defend myself from a future destruction and colonization, further colonization by the Zionist movement and the state of Israel.
Right. Spushy Kark, who writes satire, good satire, she's asking whether the global political tilt to the right, is it going to proliferate, or will the resistance in pockets come to the fore?
Yes, definitely, that's a true assessment of how political systems now develop. In the short run, it looks like it supports Israel. The more the right-wing the governments are, the more pro-Israelis they are. And Israel benefits from the rise of fascism in Europe and right-wing nationalism in other parts of the world. But that brings to the fore a different question. How do we connect the struggle against right-wing extremism in our own places with the struggle to Palestine? And it gives an opportunity to create a global Palestinian coalition, because the fight for Palestine is also the fight against fascism in Europe. It's also the fight against fanatic nationalism in India and other places. The world is a global village in that respect. And the more we'll intersect these struggles together, and I think Palestine would be a very good symbol for this intersection, we might find that despite the disappointment for how political systems are moving in the near future, it creates a potential, at least, for a very powerful coalition coming from the left and the center to oppose this kind of politics, which can only benefit people like the Palestinians in the struggle for liberation. So we need to globalize these kinds of struggles for justice and connect them more strongly. There's a good example where it was already done, and this is by the African American community in the United States, when Black Lives Matters in one moment decided that the struggle in Palestine is also the struggle of African Americans for justice in the United States. And this empowered both movements, both the Black Lives Matter movement in America and the Palestinians internationally.
Right. Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, why is the verdict of International Court of Justice not being upheld by Israel in legal terms? And why did Mahmoud Abbas cancel the elections? And who can be a better candidate than him?
Well, Israel is not going to abide by any international court. This has to be taken as a fact. The reason is they don't consider the international law as a sacred idea. In fact, most Israelis see it as an anti-Semitic institution by nature, and they're going to do everything they can to disregard its resolutions and its injunctions. You just have to be a few days in Israel and to know a little bit of Hebrew to understand that the ICJ, for instance, is described in Israel like the worst kind of anti-Semitic institution. That's how they see it. So we have to understand that. As for Abbas, he canceled the elections because he would have lost them. That's the only reason he canceled them. Who could replace him? It's not a person. What needs to replace the PA is a new energized PLO that should include the Hamas and Islamic Jihad and all the Palestinian factions. Either it's a new PLO, a new organization, but it's up to the Palestinians, of course, to decide how to do this. But we urgently need them to have a new representative, all Palestinian encompassing body that would decide who are the leaders and leadership and help us all to move forward. Without such a development, it would be very difficult to translate their courage and resilience into liberation.
Are you okay? Can we take a few more questions? I don't want you feeling as if we've just tied you to the chair. Sorry, we can't hear you. You're muted, Professor Pappé. Your mute button is on. Can you unmute?
Yes, let's do another 10 to 15 minutes because
Okay, I think we will be able to do most of them, yes. Because
Okay.
everybody is so excited to hear from you directly.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Bashri, she wants to know to what extent is the Jewish narrative of being victims of the past Holocaust and the torture and justifying its reaction to the October attack, the Hamas, and labeling it as an act of self-defense justifiable. You've said something about it, and does it hold any truth?
First of all, about the Holocaust, I think both sides, the Holocaust should not be part of this discussion, to my mind, anyway. It doesn't belong here in two ways. If the Israelis claim that the killing of 1,200 people, half of them soldiers, is like the Holocaust, then all the Holocaust deniers are correct. So what's the big deal? I mean, how you can compare industrial genocide of 6 million Jews to a guerrilla attack that ended up with hundreds of soldiers killed and hundreds of citizens killed? Yes, it's a horrible event, but it's not. This is not the Holocaust. Can we compare the Israeli genocide to Holocaust? Again, I think that the German industrial genocide, not only of Jews, by the way, we keep forgetting that they genocided 30 million other people, is a unique chapter in history's inhumanity. The only thing we need to take from that is to understand that humanity, unfortunately, had genocides before that and can still have other genocide after that. And that's horrible. That's a horrible idea that human beings are able to do this. But that's all. I don't think we should, in any other way, connect it to Gaza. Now, was the Hamas doing a self-defense? First of all, in their eyes, they did. I think they already warned Israel for many, many years that they will do all they can to release the thousands of political prisoners that Israel has, to break down the siege, and that they would do something if Israel continues to violate the sacredness of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And of course, they were also part of the liberation movement. So yes, I think Palestinians are also defending themselves. I don't think everything they do in self-defense, definitely everything they did on the 7th of October was self-defense. As I said, they also violated international law. This is part of the horrible thing that can happen when an anti-colonial war continues. If you want to prevent in the future such actions, you need to go to the source of the violence. And the source of the violence is Zionism and the State of Israel, not the Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian resistance can be more humane, less humane, behave better, behave worse, but its resistance is very justified, since the other side wants to colonize it, destroy it. So what can they do? They have to defend themselves. Most of the Palestinians would have said to the world, if you really wanted to prevent us from using violence, why don't you support our campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel? This is a non-violent method that we ask you to support. If you will help us by sanctions to force Israel to end the occupation, the oppression, we will not need to use force, armed force. But if you don't leave us any option, we're not going to be sitting ducks and just die. So there's a way to make this situation much less violent, but it depends on the international community.
Sunil Kumar, I'll come back to your question. It's a lot to do with history. I don't think it can be answered right now. Rohit wants to know, Professor Pappé, how do you see India's response to the genocide of the Palestinians?
Yes, well, I mean, it's the overall position of the Modi government is very disappointing, to say the least. And that includes the reaction to the genocide. I think that I understand the ideological connection between the BJP and Zionism. I can see the connections between their ideology and the Zionist ideology. I can see also connection between some actions of settler colonialism in Kashmir and settler colonialism in Palestine. I can see the military arrangements that seem to satisfy generals and security people. And all of this brings a kind of a half cynical, half ideological explanation for the Indian position, which betrays a much more noble Indian position in the 50s and the 60s, which I hope will come back. Because we need an India that is representing forcefully the global South and is not obedient to the global North. And only a pluralistic democratic India can play such a role, not a nationalistic, the global North. And I think that, as I say, in order to liberate Palestine, we also need some other kind of liberation struggles to succeed. And therefore, I'm hopeful that oppositions in India, oppositions elsewhere in the world, would help to create a different agenda, both in the global South and in the global North, that in the end of the day, from my very narrow-minded perspective, would also benefit very much.
Right. And everyone's asking about the opposition in Israel, the opposition parties. How are they reacting, and what is their position currently to the genocide?
Well, there are two kinds of Israel when it comes to the war in Gaza. Both of them are supportive of the genocide, unfortunately. So what the opposition wants, he doesn't want Netanyahu. He doesn't want the prime minister. He wants to use this crisis to take over the government, and he might be able to do this. It speaks a more pragmatic language, so it sounds a bit more sane than the present messianic Zionists who are in government, like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. But in the end of the day, they have nothing to offer for the future. They want to keep the Gaza Strip under Israeli rule. They want to keep the West Bank under Israeli rule. They would not allow the return of the Palestinian refugees, and they would sustain the apartheid system inside Israel. They will talk in a more reasonable language, but the policies would be the same. And therefore, I come back to the point I made. Unfortunately, we cannot pin our hopes of a change from within Israel. This is not going to happen. We will need the pressure from the outside if we want to change the reality.
Right. There are questions from Rohit and Nikita who've already asked a question each, so I'll go back to you a little later. There's somebody whose mark is market consultant, but the question is that whether this war could escalate into a world war. Do you think that?
I don't know about the world war, but I definitely think there is a danger of this escalating to a global, a regional war, because there is a war going on in the north of Israel that involves the Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran, and that could easily deteriorate, especially after the Israelis would feel that they achieved their military objectives in Gaza. And that could drag everyone into it. And then also the world. Yes, I think always there is a danger that conflict in a place like in Western Asia has the potential of dragging many countries involuntarily into this. In fact, had it not been for the war in the Ukraine, I think the danger would have been even more acute. But NATO is very much obsessed with Ukraine, and therefore we are still away from a third world war due to Palestine. But the regional war is on the cards, very much so. And again, this is one of the other visions that Israeli politicians cannot promise to their citizens. All they can promise is either a local war or a regional war. Not peace, not stability, not normal life.
Right. Onohita sort of has asked a question, and that you can see the concern in some of the questions about the world moving towards the right, becoming far more autocratic, far more intolerant, and taking over basically humane and humanity where governments are concerned. Do you feel that this trend is going to continue?
Yes, and maybe if you don't mind, this will be the last question, because I feel
okay. Yes.
Yes, I do think so. I'm an optimist, and I believe in the power of civil societies. And I think the agenda of civil societies is very different from the agenda of the elites, who are manipulating some of the civil societies for these kind of right-wing fascist regimes. But I think there is a younger generation that is with a different moral compass, with a different agenda, what is important and not important, willing to march, willing to act. And maybe these young people who are marching now all over the world for Palestine will be the future politicians. So yes, I think we should look at history in a macro-historical way and see that periods of fascism were followed by better periods. We should not give up our ability to influence the way our life are being lived and influenced by politics. We should believe, but we should not isolate ourselves. We should really have an international, intersectional movement of change. Otherwise, in any occasion, we cannot do it by ourselves. We're too weak to do it by ourselves. We need to be part of this global coalition. And we have the potential of building that one. I'm sure we have.
Right. Before I thank you, I just want to read a few comments that have been posted here from senior professors in different universities, very well-renowned, reputed academics. There is Anuradha Chinoy, who's thanked you for a very brilliant analysis. There's Mohan Rao, who says it's always a privilege to hear you, Professor Pappé. I've been hearing you and reading you for 2 decades now. It is people like you who inspire us and keep us going in India. Thank you for that. We have Zoya Hassan also thanking you very much for your inspiring lecture. Pamela Philippos, who's a senior journalist, says it's an inspiration to hear you. And of course, she's asked a question, so I'm going to leave it right now, though it's a question on the media. So, well, a lot of them have said there are many more questions. Maybe at some point we will send them to you and ask you to come back again with a better voice. Thank you
Yes,
so
I'm
much.
very happy to meet you all again in better
Yes,
conditions.
we've
Thank
all
you.
and now Nikita, I think, wants to come in and say goodbye.
Thank you, Professor Pappé. I apologize for my voice, even I have a cold. Thank you, Professor Pappé, for being a part of this important discussion on Palestine with the Citizen. It was an honor to hear you speak, and we hope you could be a part of more discussions with us in the future. It is imperative that the discussion on Palestine does not stop, especially now when so many innocent people are still losing their lives. We would also like to thank an amazing audience for joining us and interacting with Professor Pappé. It was an honor for us to host this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hope to see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.